Hey everyone. So I made a bit of a stir over the weekend by playing Black White Gideons at GP Phoenix, and I just wanted to make a response on how the deck performed, what happened, what things I would change, what I'd keep the same, and really just talk about why I played this deck at all. So the first thing is that I like to brew decks. You know that I'm mostly an Affinity player and I play it all the time, but some part of me also just wants to create my own decks from scratch and play with them. And I don't know, there's a quote somewhere that says something around the lines of if you never play a tier 1 deck, you have no brain, and if you have never brew your own deck, you have no soul, or something like that. And so this was me just taking a moment to say, against the field that I was expecting, I felt like the Gideon's deck was actually relatively well positioned for, a brew that no one really knows about or cares about and isn't particularly well tested. And so I decided that this was probably the best time I would ever have to play my own creation at a Grand Prix and do decently with it. Backing that up with 3-4-1 league results in a row on Magic Online, and then I decided to get the deck built in paper. And my thought was, I have the deck built in paper. Now I'll go play it at a GPT, and if I don't do well at a GPT, that'll help dissuade me, and I'll go play Affinity in the main event. So as you can see by my list of matchups here, I ended up winning the GPT, which gave me a couple buys. My first match was against Bant Value Town. He was playing like Knight of the Reliquary and Vendilion Click and Spell Queller and Scavenging Ooze, stuff like that. Just a bunch of like decent Bant value creatures. That match kind of went how you would expect. He played value creatures, I played Wraths, then I played Planeswalkers, and then he died. My second win in the GPT was against Affinity. I can't actually remember the specifics of that match. Actually, the player I was playing against watches this YouTube channel, and occasionally he said, "Wait a second, are you Zirnak?" And so we had a bit of a laugh about that. He definitely wasn't expecting to play against me or against this deck. Anyways, I imagine that I played Wraths and stuff and killed him, but the specifics of that one match escaped me. The third round, my opponent didn't show. I don't know why he didn't show, but both me and my friend were in the same GPT, and both of our round 3 opponents didn't show in the round of 8. So we both got free wins into the 4th round, which I guess gave me less testing, but I wasn't about to complain. The 4th round, I played against Black Red Hollow One. He kind of won the first game. Did he win the first game? I don't know. I don't know if he won the first game. Yeah, he won the first game pretty handily off the back of a bunch of recursive threats. Then I boarded into 4 pieces of Graveyard Hate, exiled the graveyards in both games, and crushed him because not having access to your graveyard means that Black Red Hollow One is not a particularly good deck. So at this point, I 4-0'd the GPT with Gideons, and I feel, wow, that worked way better than I expected in paper. And I proceeded to spend the rest of the afternoon and evening and kind of well into the night waffling about whether or not I should play Gideons or Affinity, because I knew Affinity was just going to be, great, because it's always great and I'm good at it. But as I said earlier, eventually I decided that this was the best chance for me to play my own homebrew at a GP and potentially do well. I expected the field to be lots of fair decks. Walking around the hall, I didn't see very much Tron. I saw a lot of Jund. I saw a lot of slower creature decks, like just I felt it was relatively well positioned, even if the deck wasn't inherently powerful. So I sign up for the GP with this build, and I get to my first round. It's against Merfolk. I think I lost the first game. I think it was relatively close, but I think he drew 3 Mutavault, which, not drawing a bunch of Field of Ruin, and not drawing a whole bunch of Planeswalkers, I had a hard time dealing with after I wrathed away his boards or something like that. Game 2, he had a much slower start. Game 1, he had like Vial into Guy. Game 2, he had a slower start, no Vial. I think like a bunch of Curse Catchers, and I know there was a moment where I was debating whether or not to Collective Brutality a 2/2 since I had 2 Lingering Souls in play and nothing else, and I decided to wait on the Collective Brutality, and the next turn he draws and casts a Master of Tides, at which point I just killed the Master of Waves. I killed the Master of Waves with the Collective Brutality, but in the end, game 2 and 3, combination of Wraths and Planeswalkers and Lingering Souls gets there. Round 4 against Burn. Unfortunately, being a few days ago, my memory of the specifics has started to fade for some of these matches. I just know against Burn, I didn't see a Gideon of the Trials or in either game, and I didn't see a Leyline of Sanctity in game 2. And game 1, I Inquisition him and take out his turn 2 Eidolon. He didn't have a turn 1 play. And I see like 3 lands and a couple burn spells, and I'm like, alright, I have a decent shot. And then a few turns later, I'm dead, him having drawn only burn spells and nothing else. What can you do? So I lost against Burn, which my testing online, I felt like I have a pretty decent Burn matchup. If you find the Gideon of the Trials, you're in great shape. Brutality is a giant beating for them, and Leyline of Sanctity is also a giant beating for them. Round 5, I get matched against Tron, and at this point, I'm 1-1 in matches I've actually played, and I get matched against what I regard as the worst matchup by far, which is, like, Tron, how are you going to win against it with a mid-rangey deck? And I get Tron'd the first game, so I'm feeling pretty bad about my deck choice at this point. Game 2, I keep a hand with double Field of Ruin, and I Field of Ruin Tron lands, discard some things. I play a turn 4 Gideon Ally of Zendikar and start beating for 7, having been able to keep him off Tron with the Field of Ruins. He plays on turn 6 a Wormcoil Engine, and I path it and attack for lethal with the Gideon. Game 3, I have a treasure map which scries me into a couple Field of Ruins. I play a turn 4 Gideon Ally of Zendikar. My Field of Ruins keep him off Tron. I fragmentize. There's a turn where I cast a discard spell, make him discard 1 O-Stone, fragmentize the O-Stone he has in play, and then Field of Ruin all on the same turn. And then the turn before he was going to die, like, I attack him down to 6. He's got 5 lands in play, and no possibility of getting Tron. He's got like 3 forests and 2 of the same Tron land. So, because I don't have a path in hand, I cast Cranial Extraction, and I name Wormcoil Engine. I see his hand, he's got, like, Wormcoil Engine, Worldbreaker, Ulamog, Ugin, or something like that. And I take out the Wormcoil Engine from his hand, and decline to take the other Wormcoil Engines out of his deck, since he only has 5 lands, to increase his chance of just drawing a brick on his next turn, which would give me the win. And he draws Star, cracks Star, draws the Wormcoil Engine, and dies, which I found kind of funny. Round 6 against Jund. Basically, we play some grindy games. All 3 of them are pretty decent. One game, he just goes a little bit under me. I have a little bit too slow of a draw. and he kills me, and the other games I'm able to just stabilize the board and take over and kill him. It's worth noting that in Game 3 of Round 6, I did flip Ormondal and kill him with it, and I might not have won if it wasn't for Ormondal, because he had the ability to do a bunch of nasty things, but wasn't able to race the Ormondal, and remarked after the game that he had taken out his Liliana of the Veil, because you don't really want Liliana of the Veil against the deck that's full of tokens, right? So, feeling good about my win against Jund. I get matched against Affinity in round 7, which was a feature match, so you can find it in the replay part of Twitch if you want to. It was a pretty sweet match, and so I'm going to spoil it now, and so if you want to go watch it, like, pause this video and go take a look at it. It was a pretty cool match. Game 1, he's on the play. He has a fairly explosive start. I have a Path and a Bontu's Last Reckoning, and then some other stuff in my hand I forget about. He has an explosive start with, like, a turn 1 Ravager into a couple Signal Pests. On his turn 3, he attacks me with a whole bunch of stuff. I stop him, I do the math, and I'm like, all right, if I Path the Blinkmoth Nexus, he'll eat it to Ravager, and then I'll go to like 6. He's got 1 card in hand, so he could burn me down to 2, and then I fetch down to 1. But I live, and then I can Bontu's Last Reckoning him down to a Glimmer Void, a Mox Opal, and no cards in hand. And so I take that line, I go down to 1, I cast Bontu's Last Reckoning, I sweep his entire board, he's got nothing except for a Glimmer Void and a not turned on Mox Opal. And then he draws Galvanic Blast off the top for lethal. Game 2, I keep Stony Silence into Lingering Souls and then just run away with the game. I plus Sorin Grim Nemesis a bunch of times and just demolish him. Game 3, I remember I didn't have Stony Silence, but I think I had like a Wrath of God and Lingering Souls and some lands, so I keep. He has a slower start, doesn't, super explode. I get to cast Lingering Souls. He Whip Flares it away. I draw. I've missed my 4th land drop. I cast another Lingering Souls. He taps out to cast a Etch Champion, at which point I cast my... I draw a white source and cast my Wrath of God, or Day of Judgment, I guess it was. And he loses his entire board, and then I take over from there. So then I ended up winning on feature match, which was cool. That's a first for me, because I hadn't been on a feature match at a GP before. Round 8, I get matched against Jund before, and it goes extremely similarly to my previous Jund matchup. One game, he gets down an early Liliana that I don't have a cheap Gideon to play and pressure her with, and so I end up losing because of the Liliana. The other 2 games, I kill all of his things, make a bunch of tokens, and get there. And in Game 3 of this Jund matchup as well, I also flip Ormondal to outrace him with a huge bunch of life gain. So 2 matches against Jund, 2 wins in Game 3 with an Ormondal. So at this point, I'm 7-1 going into day 2. I'm feeling really good about myself. I'm like, all right, I did not expect to do this well with this off-meta deck. This is probably better luck than I deserve, but I'm going to keep going and hope I get there. It's hard to feel too bad about your deck choice if you go 7-1 into day 2. Like, I guess maybe I got really lucky, but I felt like most of the matches that I won, I had, them well in hand, except for the one against Tron. That was kind of lucky, getting 2 Field of Ruins in Game 2 and 3. But still, I was feeling pretty good going into the next morning. I get matched against Taking Turns. I don't know what it is, but I keep a first hand that has, Inquisition, Thoughtseize, Lingering Souls, and some other stuff. So I go Inquisition, take your Dictate, Thoughtseize, take your Dictate, at which point he has no card advantage, and then I start playing some stuff, start beating down with souls, and then he chains together Ancestral Visions into a bunch of Time Walks, into Ancestral Visions, into a bunch of Time Walks, into Jace, into more Time Walks, and I die. Game 2, I get to board in a whole bunch of stuff, like Fragmentizes, Leyline of Sanctity to turn off of his exhaustions, Cranial Extraction, Rule of Law, all that kind of stuff. Don't get any of it in my opening hand, but I have 2 discard spells. Discard your Dictate, and then he draws Search for Azcanta, and then chains a bunch of Time Walks into flipping Search for Azcanta, into grabbing Jace, and flipping a thing in the ice. So it's like, he got to chain Time Walks even without his card advantage engines. This is rough. So I get a loss against taking turns, but honestly, I was mostly prepared for the closer to fair deck, so I'm not too upset about it. 7-2 is still okay. Round 10, I get another feature match, which kind of surprises me since I'm X2 at the moment. And I'm like, oh, who wants to see X2s play? I get matched against Elves. Didn't know it in game 1. My 7 and my 6 card hands in game 1 were 1-landers, which obviously aren't keepable. So I mulligan to 5 and then keep 3 lands and nothing particularly good. They're also double two basic swamps, of which I only have 3, and a Field of Ruin. So I scry, I think, a Gideon Jura to the bottom because I need to draw white sources. And Inquisition and Push are not enough to save me against a whole bunch of elves. Game 2, I keep a hand that has lands, Push, a fetch land to revolt the Push, Wrath of God, and some Gideons. And I'm like, alright, I've got a plan. I'll let him overextend into the Wrath and then Wrath away his board, and if he plays something super threatening, like an Arc Druid or an Azuri, then I can just revolt a Fatal Push and kill it. So this sounds like a good plan to me. He plays a Nettle Sentinel and gets some chip damage in, but I'm like, alright, I'm planning on Wrathing on turn 4. This is going fine. On his turn 3, he plays a Lead the Stampede and gets 4 cards off of it, at which point he doesn't cast a bunch of them and has a bunch of relatively shitty cards in play. So on my turn 4, I'm like, I know he's got the ability to reload extremely quickly with lots of guys. I know he's got a Heritage Druid off of the Lead the Stampede in his hand. So if I Wrath here, he just rebuilds the board and I'm basically top deck another Wrath or die. But he doesn't have the capability of really applying a lot of pressure to me. He's not going to have a huge ton of mana to like play an Azuri and activate it a bunch of times and kill me with that. So I can play a Gideon. That forces him to commit more to the board, and then I can Wrath the next turn and deal with the problem. At which point he's committed more resources, so the reload isn't as bad, and so that when he reloads, I already have 1 Planeswalker with some guys in play. Which makes it easier because then I can play another Planeswalker, or I can play like a Push or whatever else I draw. So I play Gideon, I make a guy, and I pass. He plays some stuff, has a relatively lackluster Lead the Stampede, grabbing only 1 new card. Attacks Gideon, I chump block his 3/3 with my 2/2 because I'm planning on Wrathing away the board, and he leaves up Collected Company. I draw a Thoughtseize, I have a 5th land, so I'm like, alright, I'm going to Thoughtseize him, I'm going to make him discard the Collected Company. If he casts it in response, then I get to Wrath away whatever he finds, and if he doesn't cast it in response, then I make him discard it, and then I get to Wrath away his board. So I cast Thoughtseize, in response he Collected Companies, and he finds Double Shaman of the Pack, and I die on the spot. Now, clearly, the game would have been different if I had Wrathed on turn 4, but I think given the information I had available to me, I think my choice, my sequencing was entirely reasonable, and I do think that my opponent got quite lucky to hit Double Shaman of the Pack. Like, someone who likes running odds can tell me the odds, but I'm sure it's got to be below 50% at the very least. He also mentions after the game, like, oh yeah, but if I hadn't found double Shaman of the Pack, I would have found Azuri and then regenerated a bunch of elves. So apparently he forgot that Wrath of God says can't be regenerated. Which kind of added a little bit of a sting to losing against elves, especially since I felt like, man, I should be pretty favored against elves with so many Wraths. But a Multi 5 and a really lucky hit off of the Collected Company later, I'm down at X3. Next match, get matched against Affinity. I've got like discard or removal spell, Lingering Souls, and a Wrath. I keep it. He plays some things. I play a discard. I take something out of his hand. He immediately rips Etched Champion off of the top after the discard. Plays it. The next turn he loads it up with Ravager counters and attacks. And I play Lingering Souls and stuff. He attacks. I play a Gideon of the Trials and emblem it. He Galvanic Blasts it and attacks. And then he attacks again because I have never found a 4th land to cast my Wrath of God. Even though I had killed like a bunch of his manlands and he had nothing else I had to worry about. So, lost because I couldn't hit my 4th land drop after, I think, 5 or 6 draw steps. And having, you know, a bunch of interaction and stuff. Also, if he hadn't ripped the Etched Champion off of the top after the Thoughtseize, like immediately after the Thoughtseize, then I would have been in much better shape. But, that's life. Game 2, I can't remember the specifics. I just know that I did things involving Wraths and Lingering Souls and Inquisitions. I don't think I had a Stony Silence, but I crush them pretty handily. Game 3, I keep like 3 lands, Inquisition, double Lingering Souls, Wrath. He leads on land, drum, Ornithopter, Vault Scourge. I Inquisition him and see land and double Ravager. I take a Ravager. Also, both of his lands I think are Glimmer Voids. So I'm feeling pretty good because I'm like, alright, you've got not a lot of pressure. I'm going to be able to get up to enough mana to cast my my Wrath of God and Wrath Away Your Board. I'll play a Souls on turn 3, and that'll buy me time, and you've got no manlands, so when I cast the Wrath, I pretty much win. So then he draws Cranial Plating attack for 6 off the top. I'm like, oh, well, I didn't draw a 1 mana removal spell, so I'm just dead because I play land go on turn 2 because he was on the play because I won game 2. And then he plays his Ravager, and even if I cast Souls, then he's attacking with 3 things that he can load up any one of them that's unblocked to the Ravager and win. So dead to the Cranial Plating off the top. Got another match against Burn. No Gideon of the Trials in game 1. He mulls to 6. I Inquisition him, take out a Burn spell, and he wins having only drawn Burn spells and me not having drawn Gideon of the Trials or any like way to keep myself alive. Game 2, I mulligan to no, I don't mulligan. I keep a somewhat risky hand. I have basic Plains, Path to Exile, Collective Brutality, Lingering Souls, a Wrath, and a Leyline of Sanctity. So I'm like, all right, I have a way to deal with his first creature. I have a Leyline of Sanctity to keep me alive until I can draw another land to cast the Collective Brutality, which should, you know, buy me enough time to like get there with Lingering Souls and stuff like that. So, admittedly, somewhat risky on the one-lander. Maybe I get mana screwed, but at least I have a path and I have a Leyline of Sanctity. He plays turn 1, Goblin Guide, attack. I reveal a Day of Judgment. I path the guide. Draw the Day of Judgment, pass the turn. He goes Swift Spear, Shockland, Revelry on your Leyline. I'm like, oh shit, this isn't good. Can't remember what I draw on the next turn. Pass the turn back to him. He plays Eidolon, Guide. I get my Swamp. And he passes the turn. I think the previous turn I had drawn Field of Ruin. Yeah, I had drawn Field of Ruin. So I wasn't able to cast the Brutality, but I did make a land drop. With my Swamp, I play Swamp, escalate the Brutality on the Eidolon. I go to like 12, and he's got... and take one of the burn spells out of his hand. And he's got Swift Spear and a Guide. He attacks again. The next turn, I Wrath Away the things. Fast forward a couple turns. I've Field of Ruined away both of his lands, both of his non-mountains. So he has 2 mountains in play. I've played Gideon of the Trials, upticked on his Eidolon of the Great Revel, and then cast Fragmentize to kill it. And I have a couple Lingering Souls in play. So I have a 4 loyalty Gideon of the Trials with an emblem, 2 souls in play, a bunch of lands, more removal in hand. And he has 2 mountains and 2 cards in hand. He draws and plays Sacred Foundry, Boros Charm on Gideon, Lightning Bolt on you. After the match, he tells me, oh yeah, I top-decked the Revelry on turn 2, and I top-decked the Boros Charm on the turn I killed the Gideon. So... feels like, man, I just keep losing to these amazing top decks by my opponent. I don't know from my story if you can tell that I feel like I've been getting some pretty bad beats on a few of these matches here. But, you know, it is what it is. Round 13, I play against Tron. He is Natural Tron Game 1, Natural Tron Game 2, but I Field of Ruin him off of it and beat him down and get there. In Game 2, he gets up to a Wormcoil Engine, and I know he has... he doesn't get Tron in Game 2, but he plays multiple O-Stones and cracks them, both time killing a Gideon that was beating him down. And eventually, I'm making, like, Westvale Abbey tokens to beat him down with, because he was at 4. He was at, like, 5, and I make a Westvale Abbey token, beat him to 4. He plays Land Go. I make another one and beat him down to 2. I know his hand is Nature's Claim. He plays a Wormcoil Engine. I path the Wormcoil Engine. He Nature's Claims in response, and then I path it in response to the Nature's Claim, getting rid of it and attacking for lethal with my Human Cleric tokens. And then in Game 3, I have, like... I don't know, I had some stuff, but I didn't feel like I could straight mulligan to Field of Ruin, since I had a relatively aggressive start of, like, curving Gideon into Gideon with some Lingering Souls and I think, like, an Inquisition. But he just had Natural Tron into, you know, all the things, and I died. Tron not being a good matchup. At this point, I'm dead for any sort of prize, so I drop from the event and go hiking in Phoenix with a friend of mine who didn't make day 2. So, overall, I felt like I played against 7 relatively good matchups. Despite my double loss against Burn, I've won most of my matches against Burn online, especially if you can draw Leyline of Sanctity and they don't immediately draw their Destructive Revelry. Tron and taking turns I don't feel particularly favored against, but the rest of it I felt pretty good against. I would feel pretty good against if I just knew what it was without having played the match. I definitely felt like there were a lot of games where I thought seized my opponent and they drew immediately what they needed afterwards, or just, you know, flip double shaman of the pack or what have you, and just kill me. As far as the deck goes, I felt like it worked pretty well, honestly. Most of the games I played against like relatively reasonable decks, I just, slowed them down with discard, wrathed away their stuff, stabilized with Planeswalkers and Lingering Souls, and just got there in the end. After the 7-1 start, even with the very disappointing day 2, I felt like, I'm never going to claim this is like a tier 1 deck or even a tier 2 deck, but I think if you have a local metagame that has mostly fair decks, like if you're playing against a lot of Jund or Abzan or blue-red stuff, I think this is a pretty reasonable deck to play. You're relatively well positioned against any kind of aggro mid-range or even a lot of control decks. A lot of people look at this and says, well, you kind of dead to control, but Lingering Souls is great against a lot of control decks. They don't like playing against tons of Planeswalkers, and I've got 11 Planeswalkers. Sure, you've got some dead removal against control, but control has a lot of dead removal against you, too. So I don't know. I think the deck is fine. I think there's definitely more tuning that could be done to it to make it maybe just a little bit better. But I do think it was a relatively reasonable deck choice. And it just felt like I had a string of bad luck. But, playing a tier 1 deck or a tier 3 deck, if your opponent draws all the answers to what you got, you're gonna lose. I don't know. Maybe I'm just making excuses and trying to make myself feel better. That's possible. But I didn't feel like it. I didn't feel like it was an awful choice. And I'm glad I decided to play this instead of Affinity, because I get to win on my first feature match that I ever was on. I got to play a cool deck that turned heads, and on some level, that's rewarding, even if it's not the I won, I cashed the GP level. I top 32 the last 2 GPs I played, individual GPs I played Affinity at, and I can't top 32 every time. Probably play Affinity at the next tournament that I go to, but I think overall I can't be too unhappy, right? Anyway, so that's the brew, or that's the story about Phoenix. Talking about some of the deck choices. Bitter Blossom, I found in some testing that I was losing some matches to like some of the grindier decks where I just wanted a little bit more pressure that I could start putting on early. Bitter Blossom I had been playing with in Affinity and it had done work there. And I tested it a bit, and making a bunch of Lingering Souls, or not Lingering Souls, but Fairy tokens, it synergized pretty well with the rest of the package. So I didn't dislike it. Felt it was pretty decently positioned. In retrospect, there's some problems with Bitter Blossom that make me leery of playing it in my deck again. I think if I would change things, I would remove the Bitter Blossoms. I think I'd probably add another Field of Ruin. Field of Ruin, by the way, overperformed all day. Like, it was color screwing Burn. It was color screwing Bant Company. There was a turn where my Bant Company opponent was at 2. He was tapped out. He had attacked me for a bunch. He had an untapped Temple Garden and a Misty Rainforest. He had a basic Plains in play, and so I Field of Ruin his untapped Temple Garden. I say, okay, now that he floated white, I say, go to my beginning of combat before declare attackers, animate my shambling event, attack for lethal. He couldn't fetch shock to go to get white because, he'd die. He didn't have another white source in his deck after the Field of Ruin, or he didn't have another basic Plains after the Field of Ruin, and he had the Path in hand. So You know, Field of Ruin taking out the White Source was the winning line, which, you know, felt good. So Field of Ruin performed really well. Bitter Blossom, just, it wasn't relevant in any game. Like, occasionally it's nice, but, like, against Jund it got Abrupt Decay immediately, and against everyone else it just didn't really do anything. So I don't know. I feel like there's probably a more impactful slot than Bitter Blossom. All of the 1-mana removal and disruption was great. Collective Brutality, you know, did work. Collective Brutality is one of those cards that it's never great, except against Burn, but it's always good. Like, you always play it and you get some value out of it. And the flexibility of being fine against a creature deck where you can just be like, well, it's a -2/-2, kill your thing. Or being fine against a control deck where you're like, well, take an instant or sorcery out. It's always nice. The combination of Wraths and Planeswalkers was great. You know, I played a lot of Wraths, and they did a lot of work, and a lot of people had their board swept away. Lingering Souls, everyone knows that card's an all-star. I activated every single mode of every single Planeswalker I have this tournament. I played all 3 modes of Gideon of the Trials, all 3 modes of Ally of Zendikar, all 3 modes of Gideon Jura, all 3 modes of Ob Nixilis Reignited. Although when I used the games that I used the Sorin Grim Nemesis ult and the Ob Nixilis Reignited ult, I don't really get to see the effects on the game because as soon as I used them, my opponent scooped. So take that as how you will. Going to the sideboard, Fragmentize. So I had shaved a Fragmentize for the treasure map. Now, Fragmentize ended up being something I wanted more of because I got matched against Affinity and against Tron and against although in my later matches against Affinities I never drew the Fragmentize, now that I think about it. Only in the first match. But, you know, Fragmentize did work. The Rest in Peace and the Grafdigger's Cage as a Graveyard Hate package. By the way, Grafdigger's Cage over the 4th Rest in Peace was there for, like, company decks, like Elves. I just didn't draw it. You know, those were excellent against the Hollow One deck, although on the most part, I just didn't run onto a whole bunch of graveyard decks, which sort of surprised me because they've been around quite a lot recently. Stony Silence, I mean, it did work against Affinity. Rule of Law is... I cited it in against the Taking Turns person, but didn't draw it. Leyline of Sanctity, man, if I had more of those against Burn, maybe those matches would have been wins. Cranial Extraction, I didn't play against too much combo. I did draw it and cast it to good effect against Tron multiple times. One time I stripped Karn's out of his hand in a match where he would have otherwise cast Karn. One time I used it to take out his Wormcoil Engine when I knew he had a Wormcoil Engine. I like it better than Lost Legacy because you're probably going to see some of the cards they've got in their hand through Inquisition of Kozilek or Thoughtseize or Collective Brutality against combo. And so not only do you take away their combo bit, but you also don't draw them into another card because a lot of these decks aren't single points of failure deck, but Cranial Extraction throws a wrench in their plan and removes some cards out of their hand. The treasure map's probably the weirdest thing for most of you guys. The treasure map was there just to... because there's a lot of matchups where removal just isn't very good. Like, there's a lot of times where I'm just like, well, Fatal Push does nothing against your deck, so I need something that's not Fatal Push that's good against just, like, everyone. And the answer that came to me was like, well, you know, card draw and card filtering is just something that's always good. And I had played a lot with Treasure Map in Standard and in Draft and Sealed, and it always was quite good there. So I decided to put it in. My games with it this weekend, it scryed me a bunch of times. One time it flipped and drew me a couple cards. One time against Jund, it ate a Shatter mode off of OK Command when it was at 2. He did Shatter and Regrowth my Tarmogoyf. But if I hadn't played it, maybe it would have been something else, and I would have played that, and it would have been less effective. and then he would have done, you know, Regrowth my Tarmogoyf, make you discard your Sorin Grim Nemesis when you're on 5 lands, and just have a Sorin in hand, which would have been a lot worse. So I was pretty happy with the treasure map. It's possible there's better options for like card draw and card filtering, but I wanted relatively painless ones just in case that was important. Because I've tried to build this deck in a way that it is not a painful mana base, and is as proof against Blood Moon as I can. For the most part, I think I've accomplished that. Obviously, there's a couple times when I have a little bit of color issue, which might be worth it, it might not be. But I think for the most part, I kind of get away with it. Really, all I need is a couple plains and a swamp. Very rarely I need 2 swamps, but I can typically find those when I do. Anyways. Yeah, I don't know of anything else to say about the deck. It's fun. I think there's room for it to be tuned and improved, and cards in the future might make it better. I think if the metagame trends towards fairer decks that are not tremendously fast, the stock of the White-Black Gideon's deck will go up. And when it trends more towards Tron and towards combo decks and stuff like that, the stock goes down. But as long as you're in metagames where piles of value and lots of wraths are good things, I think this is going to be a reasonable choice, even if it's not a tier 1 deck. And also, you know, every deck started as a pile of shit that people just laughed at. So, you know what? Lantern Control wasn't a thing until someone won a GP with it. Black-White Gideons? I don't know if it'll ever win a GP, but it'll never be a deck that performs well at a GP until someone takes it and plays at a GP with it. So I thought maybe this was my chance to like say, hey, this can roll with the best at the top, but didn't quite get there. Maybe another time. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll be posting more videos, probably about either Affinity or this, later in the week, once I get around to, you know, recording them and editing them and posting them up. Take care.